I'm going to invite our challenge lead in the topic, Victor Tafur from ICEL. Yes. They have over 5 decades of experience in sustainable development, so I think this is the perfect lead for the topic. Yeah, I'll let you take the stage.
Thank you very much. And I'll just do the introductions today, and I don't want to waste much time, so I'll just going to actually introduce the head of ICEL, which is the International Council of Environmental Law, founded in 1969. It's a group of environmental law experts when environmental law didn't exist, so they've been growing and conceptualizing, advancing how environmental law builds, and it's been reconstituted because of the challenges that we're facing. So it's a combination of former diplomats, professors, actual practitioners, and that have come together and collaborating with other entities, and I won't name a lot of acronyms, but that's the interest on using these new technologies and how they can be deployed. Of course, grabbed the attention of Professor Robinson, Rutger, and by coincidence, they started talking on a plane to Geneva, to the iGood, and that's a long story, but the good news is we're all here, and even virtual reality is helping us because we have Professor Nicholas Robinson from London joining us. So I'm going to just introduce him very briefly, and then I'll introduce the other panelists to come and join us. So Professor Nicholas Robinson is the university professor on the environment at Pace University in New York, and he has been involved in environmental law since 1969, not with ICEL, but actually with a committee on the Council on Environmental Quality, which is actually the kind of the environmental piece of the White House. So when environmental law was being built in the US, he was also instrumental in developing New York's environmental laws. Then he came to found the environmental law program at Pace University, currently ranked number 1, so he's probably had to do a lot with that. And with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, he's been involved with the Commission on Environmental Law. So with that introduction, I'll pass it on to you. Nick from London, can you connect? Can you join us?
Yes. Good afternoon, all of you, or morning, it may still be. We're at that transition moment. It's a great privilege for me to be here speaking with you from London. I'm here at meetings on the future of the planet, but you're about the future of the planet too. The challenge which the International Council of Environmental Law is presenting is who speaks for nature? How can we humans use artificial intelligence technologies and means to enable nature to speak for itself? And the focus is on the high seas. The high seas are an area beyond national jurisdiction. We have a United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea dating from 1992, but it doesn't really govern very well beyond the 200-mile zone off of everyone's shorelines because it's literally an area beyond governance. But artificial intelligence can help us create the tools for managing and providing stewardship for this region. And it's a region of vital importance. I'm very pleased that the Sargasso Sea Commission has been working so diligently on a part of the marine environment. The Sargasso Sea is an extraordinary part of the high seas. We've also collaborated with the South Pacific Regional Environmental Program, which has been working for this vast area of the South Pacific. But there is no good system yet for how we amass the knowledge about this area, 2/3 of the world, and figure out how to protect it. The ICEL and the General Assembly of the United Nations, IUCN and others, have been working on the development of a new international treaty, an agreement for the protection of biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. It goes by the acronym BBNJ. But how will we provide the tools to implement a biodiversity protection regime for the high seas? Scientists all around the world are studying the oceans. There are scientific marine research institutes in many regions. They have developed platforms for sharing knowledge, but a small island state like the Kingdom of Tonga or Vanuatu doesn't have a national scientific institute with the resources to tap into that science database. There are other stakeholders that need to know more about what's happening to the seas. The fishermen. You probably are not surprised to know that 4.3 billion humans derive a significant amount of their food from the oceans. That food chain is endangered. We humans are endangered since the phytoplankton on the high seas produce about 30% of the oxygen that all of life needs, including us, to survive. So we can't jeopardize the high seas without jeopardizing ourselves, and someone must learn to speak for the seas. So how will emerging technologies help us? This is your challenge. We have real crises happening in the high seas. Since the early 2000s, there has been a heat wave in the Pacific Ocean. It gets bigger every year. It was first seen intensely in 2014 and 16, and it reappeared in 2019. This heat wave is vast. It's called the blob because we don't have a better scientific name for it. The blob heats up water temperatures as much as 5.5 degrees Celsius above the average temperature for these parts of the Pacific. The blob affects at the top 65%, or 65 feet rather, or 2.5 meters of the water column. And the last blob has been documented as killing a great many marine species, not just fish, but marine mammals, whales. It is responsible for the loss of the food chain for migratory salmon, who then don't come back to their rivers to spawn. It's a escalating and cascading problem. And we don't really understand how the blob comes into threaten us all with this heat wave, except that we know the oceans are absorbing a vast amount of the heat from the atmosphere, which is caused by global warming. We know that the carbon that's taken into the oceans is acidifying the seas and changing the water chemistry that life in the oceans depends upon. So it's vitally important that we find ways to take the data about what we're learning from the threats we cause to the oceans and amass access to that data, and then let us figure out how to create the better stewardship systems. Environmental law can create those stewardship systems, environmental management, environmental finance. There are a great many stakeholders that could use a better knowledge about the law of the sea. But in particular, the small island states, which will suffer from climate change, desperately need to be on the same level playing field about access to data, access to the growing threats that affect their people and their biota that the big nations or the nations with advanced scientific technology have. So you're rising to this challenge. You're figuring out how we can connect all of those who work on knowing about the ocean, studying the ocean, and then connect them to the stakeholders that depend upon the ocean and create a way for the public, the people, the commons, if you will, to find a nexus with the stewardship of the high seas. And through the high seas, then we can work our way back toward land. I don't want to take away time from the people who are there in actual reality. Those of us in virtual reality will have to sign off now. But I want to thank you each for coming. I want to thank you for your ingenuity, for your thoughts. It's a great experiment we have in amassing artificial intelligence for the good of the oceans. And I thank you for your work. I'll pass this over to the panel discussion with my thanks to them for being with you today. Good luck in your deliberations.
Thank you, Nick. And I think Nick has set the stage perfectly because next will be the scientists in our panel. there was no debate really of who it should go after. We'll have our scientist come over, and before I introduce him, I want to make sure that we're ready for him. I think we are. There we go. And that means okay. Yeah, I'm going to try my Dutch. Yep.
It's working?
Okay. All right. So let me introduce, and I'll try to keep it quick because there's a lot of years here in marine science. But let me introduce Professor Howard Rowe, Emeritus Professor at the University of Southampton, and was the director of the University Southampton Oceanography Center 1999 to 2005, and he's been working on this for years, and in particular deploying how technology is being deployed in this. So, and he's part of the Sargasso Sea Commission. And with that, please come take the stage and run us through your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to see so many here.
Thank you.
I think I can promise I'm going to be the only one that shows you animals in this entire bit. Welcome to the Sargasso Sea and to the floating golden rainforests of the North Atlantic Ocean. And the rainforest is made up of two species of large brown algae, Sargassum Weed. They're the only two species of large brown algae that spend their entire lives floating around in the open ocean. And the Sargasso Sea is unique, but at the same time it's subject to the same forcing pressures and the same threats as the global ocean as a whole. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I hope to show you why this combination makes it a very good case study for looking at the problems and possibilities of conservation in the high seas.
Mike.
Sorry.
Perfect.
Did you all get that? It was very important.
It's not necessary for here, but then we have the audio for the video as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Good. That's good.
The Sargasso Sea's importance derives from four interrelated areas. There's the background oceanography and meteorology. There are the biological and the ecological issues. There's its importance for global research and monitoring, and its importance as a global resource. And we start with the background. You have to have a bit of physics here, I'm afraid. The Sargasso Sea is within, and I'm going to walk over here if I may, is within the North Atlantic subtropical gyre, which is this vast pool of slowly rotating water driven by clockwise rotating currents which surround it. And the effect of this is that it traps things within the gyre, and it traps floating material like Sargassum Weed, like pollutants, all that sort of stuff for periods of decades. So once you're in there, it's very difficult to get out. This particular patch here is the bit of the Sargasso Sea that the Commission is working actively in. The next picture is also very important. This is a thing called the subtropical convergence, and it's a mixture of warm water and cold water where they meet. And in the autumn and winter of each year, the water masses pile up either side and create temperature fronts and eastward flowing currents. And the third bit is the importance of the oceans and the atmosphere are inextricably linked. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. But in the North Atlantic, the differences in atmospheric pressure between Iceland and the Azores, it's called the North Atlantic Oscillation, controls the winds, which control the surface currents, which control the weather patterns all over Europe and the United States. So that's the physical background of the Sargasso Sea. And now we move to biology, ecology. The Sargasso mats, of which you saw pictures of right at the beginning on the early slide. Sargassum weed accumulates in mats, it accumulates in fronts, it accumulates in windrows. And the mats house unique communities of animals which are found nowhere else, and it includes 11 endemic species which are very highly adapted. My favourite one is this chap, which is a little anglerfish. It's so adapted, it's camouflaged, its fins have been turned into hands, and it walks around on the Sargassum weed. It doesn't swim at all, it just bites your finger if you put it anywhere near it. So you have this unique and special community of animals living on these mats. And also within the mats, they're a very attractive nursery and feeding area for species of fish. About 80 species of fish occur in these mats or under these mats. They lay their eggs. Flying fish build nests in which they lay their eggs. Predators sit underneath the mats and eat the baby fish. The mats house turtles, baby turtles. They used to spend, baby turtles, you used to see turtles, they run off the beach, they go into the sea, and they disappear for years and years and years. Well, the Sargasso Seas, where quite a lot of them go, this is their lost years. They spend their time sitting on top of the mats, they get an energy boost because the water's a bit warmer there, so they grow faster, and they eat stuff there. And that's where they spend their lost years. And seagulls like it, seabirds, beg your pardon. About 28 species of seabirds live there. 2 species of tern even roost on them. And the whole area is one of, it's really a crossroads in the North Atlantic. Things migrate through it, they migrate into it, from east to west, west to east, to north to south, and vice versa. And you've got humpback whales, leatherback turtles, bluefin tuna, they all migrate through it. Some migrate to it to spawn or give birth. Poor beagle sharks give birth to their live young in the Sargasso Sea. They come down from Canada to give birth in the Sargasso Sea. And of course, it's the only known spawning site of the American and European eels. They come to the Sargasso Sea, they spawn there, they die, their larvae find their way back to the rivers, either on the United States and Canada or in Europe and North Africa. So, there's a lot going on in the Sargasso Sea. It's very diverse, it's very important, purely and simply because of the diversity, the spectrum of animals, and its location in terms of breeding, spawning areas. But it's also important because it's a centre for global research in the deep ocean as a whole. And it is based largely around Bermuda. And the research program there has been going on for years, and it was there that, for instance, the most important little creature on the planet that you've never heard of was first discovered, a photosynthetic bacteria called Prochlorococcus. It produces something like 20% of the atmospheric oxygen. So if you put it another way, 1 in every 5 breaths in this room comes from bacteria which were first discovered in the Sargasso Sea. But it's also important for a time series. If you want to measure change, you've got to have a time series. And the Bermuda Atlantic Time Series, BATS, was established in 1954, and it's the world's longest time series of measurements of salinity and temperature anywhere. And it's been called the canary in the coal mine because it gave early notice of the ways in which the ocean was responding to climate change. And then everything has a value. The Sargasso Sea has a value. The different components have different values. And there have been 2 studies of the values of the Sargasso Sea. And it's very, very difficult to work out the precise values of the individual elements. But there have been 2 studies. This is the second one. It doesn't really matter whether you believe the accuracy of the numbers. That doesn't matter. But in both cases, the numbers are very, very large, indicating that there is an enormous economic value for the Sargasso Sea, which is worldwide and not just limited to a little bit of patch of the North Atlantic. Okay, so we've got an interesting place, we've got a very diverse place, we've got a very important place, we've got a very valuable place, and it's threatened. like everywhere else in the oceans, it is threatened. And there's a list here of threats, some of which are potential rather than actual, and we'll talk about a few of these. Overfishing is a threat. We have successfully helped to lobby the North Atlantic Fishery Organization to stop bottom trawling on seamounts in the north of the Sargasso Sea. And we're working with the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna to develop ecosystem modeling for pelagic tuna species. Pelagic fisheries go on mostly in the northeast part of the Sargasso Sea, and we know that the pelagic longlining is increasing. Plastic. There's so much plastic floating around in the open sea now that it's been called the seventh continent. And you know all about this now. It's now well recognized in terms of, have you got big bits like plastic bags? Have you got little bits like microplastics, which are bits under less than 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 millimeters in size? And the rotating currents of the gyre keep the plastics within it, and they concentrate within that gyre preferentially along the subtropical convergence, which is a bit unfortunate because it is there where eels, for instance, spawn, and it's almost certain that they eat plastic in their larval stages. And this, of course, is where it all comes from. This was the first attempt to summarize the state of plastic waste inputs, and it was produced in 2015, immediately before I gave a talk to the European Union about it all, so I was delighted. But it shows you that between 4 and 12 million tons per year of plastic goes into the ocean, and that's generally rounded up to, say, about 8 million tons, and that's where these numbers come from. But it comes from land, we all know that, but the point really about this slide is that almost all of the threats, or all of the threats concerned with the Sargasso Sea or the open ocean, come from outside. They come from land, and they come from us. And there's a rather strange threat, which is possibly unique to the Sargasso Sea area. It's Sargassum weed itself. Since 2011, enormous blooms of Sargassum weed have appeared off the coasts of West Africa and South America. And they've done it every year almost since 2011. You can see them on satellites. And it's almost certainly caused by a previously very rare form of Sargassum weed has suddenly bloomed because it has found a lot of excess agricultural nutrient runoff from the rivers, from the Niger, from the Congo, from the Orinoco, and from the Amazon. This has stimulated blooms of millions of tons of Sargassum weed. And this gets swept up in another circulation system to the south of the Sargasso Sea, and from there it goes up into the Gulf of Mexico, onto the Caribbean islands, and it's feet thick, and it's causing enormous socio-economic problems. It's destroying fisheries, it's destroying the food trade. It's also destroying the turtle populations. The turtles can't get through it to get onto the beaches. If they do, it just blocks the necks off, and the baby ones can't get back to the sea. And the background to all of these threats is climate change. The Sargasso Sea is warming. It's getting more acidic. And these are the trends from the Bermuda Atlantic time series, which is going on. This is one of the most fundamentally important series of measurements going on the planet today. It's vital, it carries on. It tells you what is happening. And I usually start my talk on the oceans and Sargasso Sea with this picture of the blue marble. And in fact, this time I'm finishing it. This is the blue marble, you saw it earlier. I used to say, I still do say, this is the most important photograph that's ever been taken, because it actually showed us what we look like from space. It showed us that the name Earth is a complete misnomer. Our planet ought to be called water. It also shows us that we live on a very small blob in the middle of space. There's nowhere else to go. So we've got to look after it. Looking after it in the seas has not got very far. Of the 71% of the Earth's surface, a little bit is protected, 7%, but 50% of the surface is covered by high seas. This is the areas beyond national jurisdiction. Of that high seas, That contains 90% of the living space on this planet. Of that, rather less than 1.2% has any protection. This is a fairly deplorable state of affairs, and it is, of course, subject to the ongoing debates in the United Nations at the moment. But at that point, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave David to tell you what the Sargasso Sea Commission has been doing for the last 10 years or so to try and improve the situation.
Thank you, Howard. You can take the mic. Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to take the mic to you, David Freestone. He's the Executive Secretary of the Sargasso Sea Commission, to walk us through the legal and governance pieces.
Yes, good afternoon. So I'll start talking while he's setting my PowerPoint up. So you've heard the science side, and I'm an international lawyer. We have a big debate as to who should go first. It was obvious who won, but of course the only reason that he's here is because of what we're doing. But this is a small issue. So the Sargasso Sea Commission was established in 2014, although we had a project which has been running since 2010. So I'll tell you a little bit about this.
David, can you just hold it?
Oh, hold it higher up, yeah, okay. So Howard ended by talking about the percentage about the high seas. This is a map which is actually produced by the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica, which actually shows you these areas beyond national jurisdiction. And you can see that it's actually it is 50% of the ocean. It's 50% of the, as Howard says, 70% of the planet is ocean, 50% is high seas. And we can see the Sargasso Sea here, which Howard was just telling us about. The governance structure is ridiculous, right? So every activity, all governments have sectoral ministries, right? But in the high sea, in the ocean governance, it's completely sectoral. All these lines go up and down. Look, you can see the legal issues, FAO, which is food and agriculture. You can see environment protection, development, cultural heritage, vessels, IMO, all these things. They're all lines go down. There aren't any lines across at all. And that's one of the issues which the UN has been talking about for a very long time. Initially decided in 2004 to set up a working group. It was an ad hoc informal working group. Quite the difference between, I suppose it means he didn't wear a tie, but it was not, it had no formal status, and eventually in 2000, I'll show you the timelines for this here, after the working group had been going for nearly a decade, they agreed on a package to look at a series of issues, which was marine protected areas, or what they call ABMT, which is not ballistic missiles, but it's the area-based management tools, which include establishment of marine protected areas, environmental impact assessment for activities in the high seas, the regulation of marine genetic resources, and capacity building. Those are the four items. That was formed in a package in 2011. That was recognized in the Rio Plus 20 meeting, or what South Africans called the Johannesburg Plus 10. That was in 2012. And there was an agreement to go forward with lots of acronyms, and ILBI, an internationally legally binding instrument. A PrepCom, a preparatory committee, was established in 2015. It met for 2 years. And then an intergovernmental conference has been established to actually develop a treaty. And that's now had its third session. There's a draft. There's quite a lot of work still to do. It's ostensibly, its last session is going to be in April of this year, but it seems likely that at least one more session will be necessary. So, as I said, it may not be the final negotiation setting down, but certainly the aspiration is to finish it this year. So why is the Sargasso Sea important? Same slide as Howard, but my answer is slightly different. Obviously because of the science, because it's a unique ecosystem. We chose the Sargasso Sea as an experiment. If you can't protect an iconic system like the Sargasso Sea under the existing system, the system is not fit for purpose. That's basically our message. So it's interesting that it has, even by high sea standards, a large number of governance gaps. And I'm giving you these organizations because when we're starting to look for data, these are the guys who have it. They don't always share it, but presumably this is something that's going to be quite important. So the seabed, the exploration and exploitation hasn't actually been agreed yet, the rules for it, but certainly exploration and the future exploitation of seabed minerals is governed by the Seabed Authority in Jamaica. That's a UN set up by the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention we heard about. Vessel movements, discharges, etc., the rules governing what happens. I haven't got a slide showing the amount of vessel traffic, but there is a huge amount of vessel traffic because this is an area between North America and Europe, and many of the vessels which are going through to the Pacific go through the Panama Canal. 5 years ago, was it? The Panama Canal doubled in size. So there's a huge amount of traffic going to the ports in North America, but also down through the Panama Canal. That's regulated by the London Organization, the International Maritime Organization. And then we also heard about ICAT, which has responsibility for, it's been satirized as the international conspiracy to catch all tunas, you know, that. But it's actually the organization which has sole responsibility for the regulation of tunas in the whole Atlantic, north and south. But there are no regional organizations. And a couple of maps to show you what this means. So in the North Atlantic, here, on the Northeast Atlantic, we have an arrangement which you may have heard of called OSPAR, which is so-called because of the merging of two conventions, the Oslo and Paris Agreement, which dealt with land-based source pollution within Europe and also dumping of wastes in the ocean. But OSPAR has regulatory authority, not total, but environmental regulatory authority in areas beyond national jurisdiction in the Northeast Atlantic. There aren't many other regional environmental organizations that have powers in the high seas. CAMLR, the system in the Southern Ocean there, Mediterranean is sort of cheating because there aren't really EZs, and so it's very narrow, so it is high seas, but most states in the Mediterranean only claim 12-mile territorial seas, so it's a much smaller enterprise. All the other regional agreements are really just regulate the 200 miles from the coast, except the other exception is in the rather unique arrangement of, it's called PEMPSI in the Southeast Asia and then the South Pacific, but there's not a lot of actual activity there. So that's a gap, you see, in the Atlantic there around the Sargasso Sea, and then most of the world is now covered by regional fisheries management organizations. These are organizations that regulate species that are not tuna or tuna-like pelagics. And here you see in the North Atlantic, above, I think it's what, the 36th parallel, which is just into the Bermuda EZ. On the northwest, we have the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, NAFO, and to the east, in the same area as OSPAR, we have the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Organization. Nothing in the Sargasso Sea, right down to Southeast Pacific, just off the coast of Namibia. So there's a serious governance gap there. So this project, which we set up 10 years ago now, led by the government of Bermuda, which we saw is right in the middle, we had three aims. And it was aimed as a political choice to take an area which was such an important scientific choice as a pilot for this, to achieve recognition of the global importance of the Sargasso Sea, which I think Howard's just shown you why, and I think we've made that. That's been our great success. I think we've been able to do that. And then to work with existing international and sectoral organizations to get better protection for the Sargasso Sea in accordance with the laws of the Sea Convention. So does this system work, this sectoral system that we have? And then to use this experience as an indication of what's possible and not possible under the current regime. So I'm not saying it's not possible. After 10 years, the only legally binding measure we've been able to achieve is through the governments that work with us, we have got protection for the seamounts, and certain Alphonsino fisheries have been regulated in the NAFO area, and that's the only legal measure that we can achieve. So I'm not saying it's not possible to do it with the existing system, but it's very difficult and it takes a long time. And as part of our process was actually the development of negotiated a legal declaration. It's not legally binding. The lawyers are negotiated as non-legally binding. It's not a treaty, it's a political declaration on collaboration for the conservation of the Sargasso Sea. And we now have 10 government signatories. Some of the more local players, but also some of the big guys as well. So we have the Azores, we have the Bahamas, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, Canada, which signed 2 years ago, the Cayman Islands, the Dominican Republic, Monaco, which is a big pro-environmental state within the UN system, a very champion of the marine environment, and the UK and the United States. And we have a number of other governments that have been, but you'll be pleased to know, the Netherlands has been a great support, actually financially support us. Sweden, South Africa, and Turks and Caicos Islands. We have a number of organizations that came to our meeting there in Too Fast now. And that's the area of collaboration that we've agreed. So that's the area where we're seeking to put conservation measures. We're not necessarily to make it a marine protected area per se. That area is 2 million square miles. So when we first set it up, there was horror, in the International Maritime Organization. You're not going to stop us going through that area, right? What's the purpose of this? No, our objective is to put conservation measures. At the moment, it's Wild West. There's no regulatory authority. We have a fairly light governance structure here. We have the meeting of the signatories. We have the 10 governments who meet about once a year. This year we had two meetings. We have the Sargasso Sea Commission, of which Howard is a member. It's now 7 individuals who are established experts in their fields and experts in science, but also in the governance of these areas. And they're volunteers, so they serve in their personal capacity. They're nominated by the government signatories, but then they're appointed by a decision of the cabinet, in Bermuda cabinet. And then we have a secretary, Sargasso Sea Secretariat, which is actually hosted by ICEL office in Washington, D.C., and it's lean and mean. There are only 2 of us. I'm not the lean one. And that's the members of our commission who are drawn from the UK, United States, Bahamas, Azores, Bermuda, and Canada. And the role that we developed under the Hamilton Declaration was a stewardship role. Now, we chose the word stewardship because it doesn't really have a strong legal meaning, but everybody knows what it means. It means looking after it as if it were yours. So the stewardship role, and to keep its health, productivity, and resilience under continual review, and to develop a work program and action plans for conservation, of which we have got a number. I haven't got time to deal with those, but I want you, again, for this audience, it's interesting to know this is an issue of complexity, the number of organizations, but these are also the organizations that have some information that is useful for us, we've interacted with. And it goes from the UN, but also the CBD, the Commission on Biological Diversity. I'm not going to read them all out, you can see that. ICAT, IMO, and the fisheries organizations, but also the Convention on Migratory Species, where we've had a big initiative on the regulation of European eels, the European anguillid eels, anguilla. UNESCO, IOC, OBIS, UNESCO's International Ocean Commission, has a huge database in the OBIS database, and you can see also we have an arrangement with the UNEP agreements in Cartagena in the Caribbean, but also Abidjan in West Africa because of these linkages. And we have a number of partners, both a large number of civil society organizations, but also a few private sector, like the International Cable Protection Committee, and we also link up with some of the big research projects, like the big Atlas project, which is run out of the University of Edinburgh, which is looking at the whole of the Atlantic, and also the Atlantic ecosystem, which has now been succeeded by another big project called iAtlantic. So those are our partners, and you've already seen that. So that's slightly different, but that's all the same content. So those are the threats. That's the issues why we're still interested in. After 10 years, and with a decent budget and a lot of extremely highly motivated people, including Howard, we've actually managed to achieve certainly international recognition. We've got one legally binding measure. We have a number of work programs in place with ICAT. We have work with the conventional migratory species on eels. Not making any progress with the International Maritime Organization as yet, and we've also just signed a memorandum of understanding with the Seabed Authority, because in the center of the Atlantic is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and that's just to the east of our area of interest. There are 3 mining exploratory concessions: Russia, France, and just recently Poland. So mining on those ridges could have a major impact into the system, because it's just at the end. And so I've got a minute left, and I pass it to somebody else. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Right, well, so I'm sure you've enjoyed this deep dive into the Sargasso Sea, and this is where we get now a chance to try to know a little bit more about you and your interest in this challenge. So I want to invite you, panelists, back. And for our panel, I also want to invite, yes, Professor Koh Kheng-Lian. Yes, please come join us here. You want to? Let's start the Q&A, and I'll tell you. She's let's just introduce her, and I'll keep this with you as you can move it around. She's a professor of law emeritus at the National University of Singapore, and has been worked on governance. She has an extensive record of publications. She has worked on the Asia-Pacific regional context, so she's here to support our panelists. And now is when we get a chance to hear from you, any questions you might have. And we have a mic there, and ready for questions. Right there.
I'm specifically really interested in the amount of fertilizer and the types of fertilization that happens with the Sargasso Sea, because my area is agriculture, and I'm trying to actually reduce the amount of fertilizer being used. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this can affect the ecosystem there.
Well, I guess this relates to Sargassum Weed.
And also run off into the ocean.
Yeah. The reason the Sargasso Sea is not clogged up with Sargassum Weed like those blooms is because it's oligotrophic. It has very, very low levels of plant nutrients like nitrates and phosphates. There are no large rivers disgorging into it. The reason the blooms have happened, it is a specialized form of one of the 2 species, which was discovered in 1930 and then forgotten all about, because it lives somewhere in the southern part of the North Atlantic Ocean. And since 2011, and virtually every year since, this particular form has bloomed massively. And the reasons for that are varied and complex, but almost certainly a primary driver is the runoff of agricultural nutrients from the rivers Niger, Congo, Orinoco, and Amazon. And this has hit an area of the ocean which had very low nutrients. The little bits of Sargassum Weed basically said to themselves, hello, it's Christmas, we're going to grow. And grow they do. And they produce millions of tons in response to this. And it's several feet thick. It then gets swept up and finishes up on the beaches. In terms of how much nutrient, I have no idea. But it is, that's the primary cause almost certainly. There are others like windblown sand off the Sahara, like the general warming of the oceans and stabilization of the water column where the blooms start and that sort of stuff. But if you take away the nutrients, I would bet money you won't have these blooms.
We have 5 minutes left, so
Okay.
do you want to do one more question quickly?
Yes, right.
Thank you. I would very much like to hear maybe a little more from you as where do you think the problem is coming from? So you showed us a number of signatories, but that to someone who doesn't know the issue, looks like a very random list of countries that signed and others that didn't, probably. So I'm wondering whether you could say a little more about which actors would have to act how so that you would have an improvement of the situation. Who would you be addressing also with this challenge in mind? What kind of ideas are you thinking of for this?
That's a more difficult question, so I'll take that one. Thank you. No, good one. They aren't random, actually. The only one which I sought to explain was Monaco, because it's a little bit out of the... It's a Mediterranean country, right? A very small Mediterranean country. But the others are all around the Sargasso Sea. If you think of Bermuda, then so obviously the United States and Canada, and then these countries of the Caribbean, Dominican Republic gets a lot of impacts from that, the British Virgin Islands, and the Cayman Islands, and then up the other side we've got the Azores, and then the UK and Bermuda itself. So that's the kind of and then the other players who we've been talking to for a lot are the European countries. So the European countries have a lot of stake in eels. Now, eels are now critically endangered. The European eel is critically endangered, less than 10% of historic levels. A lot of that's to do with the way that it's regulated within the countries where it lives its life, right? So in the European countries, like North Africa, where it lives most of its life. But as Howard was saying, when they get to the age of about 10, 15, 20, they swim this 3,000 miles down to the south. This has now become, because the sushi trade, the Chinese have started to harvest the small glass eels as they come back in by buying them from local fishermen. The export has been banned within the EU, but not in the other countries, not in North Africa, for example, and also in the Caribbean countries where the American eel larvae end up as well. So that's now become $1 billion industry. So that's a major issue. So it's nothing going on in the Sargasso Sea that we can work out, but there may be changes in the amount of larvae that are being produced as a result of changes in temperature. There may be the areas where they spawn may change, etc. So most of the activities that give rise to problems are from outside, as Howard said. So big merchant vessels moving through mostly from Europe, but also from China and from the east. The impacts of fishing, most of that's done by distant water fishing boats. So maybe the Taiwanese, which are showing up in those areas, those slides that Howard showed. So we want to engage as wide a group as possible, but the people who have the most interest to start with are the ones who live around it. Sure.
Thanks, David. Maybe just one more remark from you, and then we can, Victor can help us wrap it up.
Yes, please.
Question for her, maybe?
I would like to ask the same question again. What do you hope to get out? I mean, the problems are enormous, but what would you specifically for this challenge like to get out? What would you be happy if the challenge brings in a couple of months?
Well, we've got Howard said, everything's very data poor. So the whole high seas is data poor. We may have more data than most because of the work of the Bermuda series, the Bermuda Ocean series, etc. But we think there's a lot of other information out there, which is why I gave you the list of all the players, which you can't give access to. ICAP, for example, produces reports of fishing activities, which are reported by the vessels themselves, but they put them into, 5 kilometer squares. So it's so big that it's useless to know where it is. Okay. So it's all the data.
Okay. Well,
I think if I may, what I'd like to see is a bringing together of the various data sets that do exist, and there are some. Bermuda is fundamentally important for the environmental situation. We have fisheries data from the fishery commissions which can be incorporated. We have all sorts of different data sets like that, but that's what they are. They're separate data sets. And if a means can be found of bringing those together so you can interrogate them on the same sort of time and space scales, that's got to be progress.
And I think to conclude, I'm going to pass it on to Professor Kheng-Lian.
Just 3 sentences. I want to bring to your attention the Singapore Model Framework on AI Governance. And this was launched on the 21st of January at the Davos Economic Meeting. I brought this up because, Rutger, in your why join this you brought up the question of ethics. I think it is very important when we look at the stewardship of SCC, you're collaborating with so many institutions, and you mentioned just now that they don't always give you the data. And this is an ethical question, and there are 12 elements on the principles of ethical, on the role of stakeholders. So I think it's very important.
Thank you, and we'll be around so we can continue this dialogue as we move. Thank you very much for coming.